This is the audio lecture for Chapter 5 out of the Nye text, the title of which is Cultural Uniformity or Diversity. The title of this chapter is a little different than those that we've had so far. Uh, the form of it is not really in a complete question, as earlier chapters have been, but rather it is in the form of something that still has a question mark at the end of it, but which is really sort of a choice of two options. A choice of two options here, uniformity or diversity. Two ideas which we'll take a look at here momentarily. But it's a little bit of a different kind of question than those that Nye has been so far asking in the titles of his chapters. This quotation here, which is just right out of the first page of chapter 5, is, I think, the best summary that he gives, or one of the best summaries that he gives as to what is at the heart of chapter 5. He asks, are advanced technologies being used to homogenize the world, dissolving distinctive cultures into a global system, or are advanced technologies being used to create more social differences? So the distinction here is between homogenization or uniformity, standardization, if you will, between that and differences or differentiation or diversity. And so we can look at this choice or this set of options as being sort of a fundamental tension, and a tension that Nye spends most of the chapter in chapter 5 exploring, a tension between two different sets of ideas or two different sets of characteristics. Um, the column on the left being basically synonyms for one another, or very similar concepts, and then the ones in the right-hand column also being synonyms or very similar concepts to one another. So on the one hand, you have homogenization, similarity, standardization, uniformity, or conformity. And on the other hand, you have diversity, difference, differentiation, heterogeneity, and individuality. Before going any further, I want to make sure that everybody has a clear understanding of some of these terms that may not be quite as familiar as the others. The first of these being homogenization or homogenizing. This is a term that has a prefix homo that is similar to some other words that you may be familiar with that prefix, such as homosexual. Basically, the prefix homo, wherever you see it, means the same. And so homogenization is a process that makes everything the same. So when we saw in that quote on the last slide, Nye asking the question of whether or not technology is being used to homogenize the world, he's asking whether technology is being used to make all of the cultures in the different parts of the world all the same as one another without any real differences between them or among them. Homogenization is a concept or a term that you might be familiar having heard in connection with the homogenization of milk or the homogenization of different beverages or food products. And what's involved there is bringing together of different food or beverages from different sources and making them so that they all have the same quality or the same consistency. And so it's in that same respect that we use homogenization in a more abstract sense in terms of talking about it in relation to people and societies and cultures. Heterogeneity in the right-hand column is similar to homogenization or homogeneity, with the prefix hetero meaning different, just as in heterosexual. The distinction between homosexual and heterosexual is similar here as here between homogenization and heterogenization, or homogeneity or heterogeneity. The same, making things the same or allowing things to be different. Then there's a distinction between the two terms here, difference and differentiation. Differentiation is a matter of looking at what are the characteristics that make something different. And differentiation is a term and a concept that is often used in connection with products of one kind or another. There's a phrase that is product differentiation. You'll sometimes hear the phrase product differentiation in the context of a particular industry. In a particular industry, between companies or among companies, what are those qualities that make the products different from one another? And that is what product differentiation is. And so here we're talking about differentiation. What are the qualities that make something different from something else? So these two sets of characteristics, those in the left-hand column and those in the right-hand column, there's sort of a tension between these two sets of characteristics when it comes to the use of advanced technologies and what they're doing to the world, creating uniformity or creating diversity. So which of these does technology create? Does technology create uniformity or does technology create diversity? And this is sort of the basic question or the basic opposition that is at the center of chapter 5. Now, Nye begins the chapter, or early in the chapter, talks about sort of the historical way in which this question was looked at by looking at and citing some of the work by thinkers such as Veblen and Riesman, as well as a few others. And basically what happened historically in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century is that these writers and these intellectuals saw a movement towards homogenization, towards uniformity, and towards standardization by virtue of the technologies that existed. And this was a pretty big deal in these decades. And we're talking about roughly the decades between the 1880s and the 1920s or 1930s. And this was a time when new technologies such as mass production were very new things in the world. The idea that factories and technological production processes could turn out goods that were identical to one another, and every one of them was exactly the same, had a uniform quality to them, and a standard size and a standard quality. This was a very new idea at this time in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Production techniques such as Ford's assembly line and other associated techniques for creating consumer products of various kinds. This was a very new idea, and a lot of the intellectuals, such as those that Nye cites, saw things as sort of becoming the same. Differences that had previously existed in products and other things created by artisans were disappearing, and so it was generally seen by a lot of thinkers that things were moving, society or culture was moving towards a very high degree of standardization. Now, in more recent decades, especially those in the last half of the 20th century, post-World War II period, um, the way that things have been seen is that there's been much more heterogeneity, much more differentiation that has existed and that has emerged, but even this within a framework of similarity and uniformity. There's still been standardized aspects to the products of technology, but an allowance for much higher levels and a much greater degree of heterogeneity and differentiation amongst those products. And Nye spends a good chunk of the chapter then looking at some of these examples in the post-World War II period, or from about the mid 20th century through to the later part of the 20th century. Examples where there was a movement away from standardization and towards a greater degree of difference or differentiation. One of the key examples that Nye uses in this respect is that of a town called Levittown, New York. Now, Levittown, New York is, and the role that it played in American history, is one of those things that Nye sort of assumes some knowledge about on the part of the reader. And so it's one of those things that in this particular lecture, introducing Chapter 5, I'm going to give you a little information about so that you have got some knowledge about it. Levittown, New York was a suburb in the New York City area, and in the post-World War II period, late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, America was going through suburbanization. Prior to World War II, suburbs in the way that we know them now in American metropolitan areas really did not exist. It was only after the end of World War II that suburbs began to emerge, and that was partially due to the fact that transportation technology had not advanced to the point where automobiles were the standard form of transportation for a high number of people. And cultural things and so forth that led the immediate post-World War II period of the late 1940s through the 1960s to be a period when these suburban areas emerged, and many of them with mass-produced standardized housing. In other words, houses, most of which looked exactly the same, had standard floor plans, and were mass produced, built in large quantities, many houses, multiple houses, all built at the same time in areas that had previously been just empty land. Here's a picture as an example of what Levittown looked like in this immediate post-World War II era. Houses that all sort of looked the same were basically identical to one another, and rows of them on block after block in areas that were brand new construction, brand new housing developments. Levittown was one of the cities in the immediate post-World War II period that sort of pioneered the whole idea of the housing development. Prior to this time, houses and new areas of cities or towns were not built in the way that we're now familiar with, in which several blocks in one development were all built at once and the roads paved and added at once. It's become something that we're familiar with, but at the time in the post-World War II period, this was a new idea, the idea that whole developments of housing would all be built at once. And so, as a new idea, there was some fears that people had, intellectuals and political leaders, feared that the standardized surroundings that these sort of housing developments represented would create standardized people, that everybody would be the same. There wouldn't be any individual differences or very few individual differences amongst people. And so that is sort of the context into which, um, or in which Nye is talking about Levittown as an area that when it was first built was very standardized in nature. And also which over time then, the high level of standardization that existed initially when these houses were built has gone down. As time passed, these tract houses, which originally, when they were built, all looked pretty much the same, changed due to modifications. People painted their houses different colors, remodeled them, built on additions, made personal changes to them through successive owners of a house. And so, as a result of that, the differentiation and the diversity in these housing developments in an area like Levittown increased. So we had a movement away from standardization and a movement towards diversity or differentiation. Nye also discusses this phenomenon of the movement away from standardization and the movement towards differentiation and diversity in the context of both automobiles and telephones as consumer products. Automobiles, in the early decades of when they were available as consumer products, basically were available in such a way that each automobile company had just a single model and oftentimes just a single color as well. The saying goes, which Nye quotes in chapter 5, that Henry Ford, the creator of the Ford Motor Company, said that you can get a Model T, which was his original model of car. You could get a Model T in any color you want as long as the color you wanted was black, because that was the only color that it was available in. And so, over the course of the 20th century, automobiles went from one model and one color available for a car to what we now have and started to have in the post World War II period of multiple yearly models, new updated models every single year, different colors that were available, different options in terms of the standard sort of options that you are familiar with now, in terms of seats and radio and tires and other features that you can get in your automobile. The same sort of trajectory occurred with telephones. Originally, telephones all pretty much looked the same, plain, black, nondescript, um, not a lot of design variation and that sort of thing, to eventually having a great many different designs and styles, different colors of phones available, as well as different telephone services, where originally everybody just had basic telephone service. Eventually, by the end of the 20th century, you could add different services such as call waiting, caller ID, and many others that could be added on to differentiate the services that you could get as a telephone customer as well. So these two examples that Nye goes into some detail about automobiles and telephones are two of the things that he talks about in terms of the movement from more standardized products to products that had a great deal more variation and a great deal more differentiation in them, and that this movement from standardization to differentiation was motivated basically by consumer demand. That consumer demand was such that people wanted to have different colors and types of automobiles and telephones. A couple of other things that Nye talks about in relation to this idea of consumer demand for differentiation or diversity in products is department stores and batch production. Department stores being uh, the site of a great deal of consumer variety in terms of consumers wanting to have different varieties of products. One of the things that Nye talks about and the sources that he cites in his discussion about department stores talks about China, China sets and plates and that sort of thing. People wanting a wide variety of different kinds for sale in department stores. The other thing is batch production. This is distinguished from mass production or assembly line production. Batch production being a method of production which is a little bit different from mass or assembly line production in that things are produced in batches. He talks about beer being made this way, I believe, and also some collectible sorts of products made in this other way that's distinct from mass or assembly line production, and that batch production is a production technique that fosters greater diversity in comparison with that that's possible through mass assembly line production. Two concepts that Nye talks about near the end of the chapter are what are called glocalization and creolization. These are both things that he talks about in the context of what we normally think of when we think of diversity, which is ethnic diversity or cultural diversity, racial diversity. And he talks about both of these also in relation to not so much consumer demand um, as consumers doing different things with products and relating to different products. Glocalization is possibly a term that you've heard before. It is sort of a mashup, it's a word that's sort of a mashup of the term globalization and the word local. So what's going on with things that are labeled with the term glocalization is that you have a product or a service that is largely globalized in nature, but which has some local characteristics to it. Such as McDonald's, the restaurant McDonald's, is the chief example that Nye gives of this in the text. McDonald's has got a very well known and established set of products that it sells. And whether you are at a McDonald's in Shanghai, China, or Paris, France, or South America, or in Minnesota, those products are going to be, to a great extent, exactly the same. There's a great deal of standardization to them, and there is a great deal of similarity or being exactly the same. But glocalization in relation to that is an idea that allows for some local differences. So different sorts of beverages might be served in some particular localities right alongside Big Macs and the other things that you would expect to find in a McDonald's. There's some products that are in the menu mix, so to speak, that are more local in nature. Creolization is a word or a concept that has been developed from the whole idea of Creole culture, which was located or is located down in the Mississippi Bayou in Louisiana and New Orleans area. that area historically was occupied by a number of different cultures over history, over time during history. French culture, Spanish culture, the British, Americans, and Creole culture has taken little bits and parts of all of these different cultures and combined them to create its own unique culture that has aspects of all of these different uh, original cultures. And so the concept of creolization as a concept is that little bits of different things can be taken, whatever a person likes or enjoys about something can be taken a little bit here, a little bit there, and combined to create something that is not at all like the original cultural product, but involves or represents a rather unique creation or a unique combination created through a process of creolization. Finally, Nye talks a little bit about the idea of the digital divide, which um, you may have heard of this idea before as well. It is one that has gotten quite a bit of publicity and quite a bit of discussion over recent years. And the digital divide is the idea that in American society, many other societies too, but in American society, there is a divide between people who have the means and the ability to own a computer, have monthly internet access, and both of those things which allow them to access and have regular access to everything that the internet offers in terms of the services, the products that are available through the internet. And then that on the other side of the divide, there are people who cannot afford to own a computer, cannot afford the monthly cost of having internet access, and that puts them at a disadvantage in terms of existing in American society. And so this digital divide has some implications for um, the amount of diversity that there is able to be in American society and for the use and understanding of the internet and the understanding of use of computers. So one final note in relation to this is that Nye talks about how originally computers heralded technology as a harbinger of standardization, meaning that uh, computers were a standardized product and promised a great deal of standardization, um, just like many other technological products, but also that technology in the form of computers served as an engine of differentiation, meaning that within the context, within that framework of standardization or similarity, there is great possibility for differentiation and great possibility for diversity.